Today's story is titled, The Insects in the Barn Are Praying by K.V. Haro. The link to the story is in the description below. Please enjoy. I remember the sound of my car's tires crunching over the gravel. It took me back to childhood, to evenings in my father's pickup after a long day of harvesting crops and tending livestock. Farming had been in my family for as long as anyone bothered to remember. Even though I had traded that life for a less labor-intensive office job, the dust kicked up on my car as I drove up the driveway still felt like home. The barn was the first thing to rise out of the dust. It used to be painted a deep oxblood red. My father had always gone above and beyond to make sure it looked like the picture on a postcard. He would often miss dinner after spring harvest because, as he put it, those damn European starlings shit all over the barn again. Never mind that the mess was something only a passerby in a small airplane might notice, and only if they happened to be using binoculars mid-flight. Dad had always been a stubborn goat, and the starlings were not about to change that. Now the paint had flaked and dulled to a rust-red crust, and one of the two large barn doors had slipped partly off its hinges, leaving an opening of about a meter. A part of me grew anxious at the sight of it. For a moment, I was a boy again, afraid one of the cows might escape, and that they would spend the entire afternoon searching the fields, bribing it with apples and carrots before Dad found out. My father was a good man, but the farm had rules, and loose animals were one of the sins he took personally. Lucky for me, it had been years since there had been any cows on the farm. The farmhouse seemed to be in better condition. It looked smaller than I remembered, but I could tell my parents had taken pride in caring for their home. I got out of the car and shielded my face from the early afternoon sun as I inspected the house I had grown up in. There was a layer of dust on the windows, sure, but the porch leading up to the front door seemed as charming and inviting as ever. 2 rocking chairs sat in one corner, and the soft breeze made one of them sway gently back and forth. I tried to imagine my parents spending their evenings together on the farmhouse porch, but I had to stifle a chuckle when I pictured my father attempting to relax, all while fighting the urge to climb onto the barn roof for the 15th time. In my memories, they had always remained young, but every time I visited, I noticed they had grown a little older, a little grayer. Some part of me knew that, if I ever had children, my father would have let them swing from his arms like little monkeys. He would have laughed through the pain, refusing to admit that every sensible part of his body was calling him a fool. The inside of the house felt strange in its stillness. I don't know what I expected. Everything looked almost untouched, as if my parents had simply gone out for an afternoon stroll and were bound to return at any moment. Their coat still hung by the door, and my mother's reading glasses lay open on the arm of her chair. For a while, I stood there listening to the house, waiting for some ordinary sound from the kitchen or upstairs. I almost sat down on the couch to wait for them, just so I could ask about the broken barn door. Then I had to remind myself that they had not gone for a stroll. No one had seen them in months. I did not want to be there any longer than I had to. The more time I spent inside the farmhouse, the more I noticed things that did not fully make sense. There were bowls and pots on the dining table, positioned as if someone had set them down only minutes earlier. But they were spotless. No smell of broth or onions or anything cooked and forgotten. Who sets an empty pot on the table? It looked as if the food had simply evaporated. Soup, I'm assuming, judging by the ladle. Now, I know my father could eat a lot, but my mother had a tendency to cook for an entire battalion, and I knew for a fact that Dad could never finish one of Mom's meals by himself, no matter how often he claimed he had once literally eaten an entire house after spending a day saving the crops from the frost. I left the table as it was. There was nothing to clean, and that only made the scene feel stranger. The second thing I noticed came later that evening, after I had spent a few hours sorting through drawers, cupboards, and paperwork. I was standing on the porch in the evening sun when I realized there was no wildlife. No birds in the hedges, no crickets hidden in the grass. Those sounds had been constant throughout my childhood, so familiar that I had never really heard them until they were gone. The wind moved through the trees and across the high grass, but nothing answered. The absence of insects made even less sense. There were no flies around the porch, and no grasshoppers in the field, no bees drawn to the wildflowers. At that time of year, the whole meadow should have been alive. I could find an excuse for the empty pots and bowls on the dining table. Perhaps my mother had misplaced them while cleaning the kitchen. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not find an excuse for the missing bugs. I went back inside before the sun was fully down and closed the door behind me. That night, the silence followed me upstairs. I lay in my old bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, waiting for the familiar chorus outside the window, which never came. I found some comfort in knowing I only had to stay for a week. There were formalities to deal with, papers to sign, people to call. If the house had Wi-Fi, I might have played cricket sounds through my phone just to make the room feel less wrong. Instead, I lay there until dark began to lose its shape, and at some point, I slept. A painful sting woke me in the middle of the night. For a few seconds, I lay still, one hand pressed on my stomach, waiting for the pain to fade. It didn't. I pulled the sheets away and found a red, swollen mark just above my waist. There was no sign of whatever had bitten me. So there are insects here after all. It was the first time I'd spoken out loud since arriving at the farm, and hearing my voice carry into the hallway felt strange. The house itself was not that big, but the way my voice bounced off the walls made the space feel larger than it was, as if the hallways had stretched itself while I slept. A soft thud came from inside my room. It repeated every couple of seconds. At first, I thought something was tapping on the window, but that made no sense. My bedroom was on the second floor, with no balcony below it and no tree close enough to scrape the glass. I got out of bed and slowly made my way towards the source of the noise. By then, I had almost forgotten about the bite on my stomach. The pain could wait. Curiosity had taken over, and adrenaline had silenced the throbbing. I tried to avoid the creaky floorboards as best I could, but it had been so long since I slept in that room. Tap. The sound grew louder with every step I took towards the window. It sounded urgent, as if whatever was on the other side desperately needed me to listen. I raised my hand and slowly grabbed the dusty curtain. I figured a quick pull would startle the intruder long enough for me to get a good look. Perhaps it had not noticed how close I was yet. Tap. Could someone actually be there? Another tap. Louder. I yanked the curtain as hard as I could. Something large and soft hit my face. Wings dragged across my cheeks, damp and frantic, leaving a faint smear on my face. It felt colder than it should have, almost greasy, and smelled faintly of wet flour and crushed leaves. I stumbled back and turned in place, searching for whatever had struck me. A pale shape darted across the room and vanished into the dark near the ceiling. I flicked on the light. The ceiling was empty. So were the curtains, the corners, the wall above the wardrobe. There was no sign of it. For a moment, I thought it had flown into the hallway. I took one step towards the door, then stopped. Something touched my back. The pressure was faint, then tiny legs pressed into my skin. A large moth crawled over my shoulder and onto my arm, leaving behind a thin trail of the same damp residue that had touched my face. I shook my arm like a madman trying to get the thing off. When it finally released, it struck the nearest wall and tried to take flight again. Its wings beat weakly, enough to lift it from the floor for a moment before it dropped back down. It buzzed softly against the boards, its large wings trembling until whatever strength remained inside it was spent. Then it stopped moving. I waited before touching it. Even dead, I expected it to twitch beneath my fingers. When it didn't, I picked it up by one wing, opened the bedroom window, and threw it outside. I watched it drop, only for the wind to catch its body and sweep it into the grass. Still, something bothered me. I could have sworn the sound had not come from inside the room. I reached through the open window and tapped against the glass from the outside. It sounded exactly like what I had heard earlier. That should have comforted me. It didn't. The moth had been inside when it touched me. I gripped the frame to slide the window shut. Then I stopped. I had only noticed it because the window had begun to close, a low droning sound somewhere outside, woven so faintly into the dark that I might have missed it if the house had not been so quiet. I stood there with one hand on the frame, listening, but the sound seemed to shift whenever I tried to place it. One moment it came from the fields, the next from the trees beyond them, and then from nowhere at all. By the time I had almost convinced myself it was only the wind rustling through the grass, it faded. I did not sleep much for the rest of the night. I opened the window several times because I thought I heard the droning again, but each time I was met with silence. Maybe I had imagined it. It had been years since I had slept in that house, and after the moth, it was possible my mind had started inventing sounds to fill the quiet. I spent most of the second day digging through my parents' belongings. In the living room, I found myself lingering in front of my father's lighter collection, neatly displayed in a small glass cabinet. He had never smoked a day in his life, but he admired the beauty of a well-designed lighter. Some of them, I was sure, would fetch a pretty penny. There was one shaped like a bullet, which he claimed had been carried by a notorious Russian soldier during the war. He also owned a vintage lighter that produced 2 flames instead of 1. "So you and the missus can light one at the same time," he used to say, always in a terrible imitation of a chain smoker's voice. The ugliest one looked like a jack-in-the-box. You had to crank the handle until a clown sprang up and spat flames from its mouth. Dad had loved it, which made me hate it less. I took the couple's lighter from the cabinet and carried it out to the porch. For a long time, I sat there flicking it on and off, listening to the wheel click and watching the 2 small flames rise together. It was a stupid thing to cry over, but I cried anyway. Late in the evening, I heard it again, a low drone, coming from somewhere on the property. Only this time, it sounded more methodical, almost like breathing. I tried to ignore it at first. I was not in the right frame of mind to deal with yet another issue, but I slowly started to understand where the noise was coming from. The barn. I got up and squinted towards it. In the last of the light, it looked flatter than it should have. Its open door no longer a gap, but a black strip cut into the red wood. Had the door always been that open? I had noticed the gap when I arrived, but now it looked wider than I remembered. The thought of a squatter came to me. A person in the barn would have been frightening, yes, but at least it would have explained the noise. There was not much daylight left, and if I did not want another sleepless night, I had to figure out what the noise was. I made my way across the darkening path. The buzzing had quieted by the time I reached the door, but I could still hear a faint scuffling inside the barn. It was hard to place. At first, it seemed to come from the left side. A few seconds later, it came from overhead. Whatever it was, it moved faster than my ears could follow. I slipped through the gap and went inside. The air was warmer than it should have been. It clung to the back of my throat, carrying the sour smell of old hay that had been damp once and never dried properly. Whatever light my phone gave me seemed to be absorbed by the barn's dark walls. The beam caught the gardening tools along the wall and a few leftover bales of hay piled beneath the hayloft. Everything appeared where it should have been. I had expected disorder, broken boards, nests, droppings, something obvious enough to blame. I stood in the dark with my phone in my hand and understood, slowly, that the barn had gone quiet because I was inside. My eyes followed the shaky circle of light as it moved across the old machinery. Dad's Ford 7810 stood in the corner, its blue paint dulled beneath years of dust. In the weak beam of my phone, its square headlights caught the light and held it like dull glass. The reflection made something skitter away behind me. I turned around in time to see a mass of small bodies retreat from the light and vanish between the boards. I swallowed and slowly backed towards the old tractor. Something cracked beneath my shoe. I froze. The sound moved through the barn and came back to me in 100 small scratches. I lifted my foot slowly and lowered the phone. Glass. A bent metal frame. For a moment, I did not understand what I was looking at. Then the shape became familiar in the beam of my phone, and I wished it had stayed meaningless. I had stepped on my father's glasses. We had checked the barn multiple times throughout the search for my parents. Not once had anyone found these glasses. It didn't make sense. They would have been the first thing I noticed had it not been so dark inside the barn. But there was no mistaking them. They were his. "Dad?" My voice didn't echo the way I expected it to. The barn seemed to take the word into itself, hold it for a moment, then return it as skittering. If only I had more light. The tractor. Dad was always losing the keys to his machinery, so we eventually convinced him to leave them in the vehicles. No one lived close enough to steal anything, and besides, Dad used to say the cows would make better alarms than any dog, which meant the key might still be in the tractor. I could use it to turn on the lights. The Ford was only a few steps away. I used the weak light I had to scan the floor in front of me. I placed every foot as slowly and deliberately as possible. Even the smallest noise I made stirred the presence on the walls. Each wave of skittering grew more agitated. When I reached the tractor, I put one hand against its metal frame to steady myself. It felt cold beneath my palm. Dad would never have let me climb onto his most prized possession, but this was an emergency. I'm sure he would have understood. I slowly opened the door and lifted myself onto the seat. The spring squeaked beneath my weight, and the entire barn answered. I felt around the steering wheel while using my phone to illuminate the tractor cab. I couldn't see whatever was moving around me, but I knew it was there. Closer now. My fingers finally touched a small metal key inside the ignition. I turned it. The tractor's headlights came on. For a moment, the barn seemed to move around me. At first, I thought the walls themselves had shifted. Then the light steadied, and I saw what covered them. Moths layered over moths. Beetles tucked into the seams between boards. Pale larvae gathered in corners like spilled grain. Spiders hung in loose clusters from the beams, their legs opening and closing as if testing the air. A loud drone filled the building. The sound came from everywhere, but I could feel it gathering behind the tractor, where the headlights did not quite reach. Then, the lights flickered. The tractor's battery was almost dead. I swung open the door and jumped down, misjudging the distance in the dark. My foot hit the floor wrong, and I went down hard, face first into the dust. For a few seconds, I could do nothing but lie there, coughing, while the barn blurred and shifted around me. The headlights flickered again. Then, I heard my name. Henry. It came from behind the tractor, from the place where the droning was thickest. It didn't really sound like a voice. It sounded like hundreds of tiny noises trying to mimic one. I got to my knees. The tractor's lights flickered again, then steadied. Behind the Ford, a reddish light pressed up through the broken floorboards. It was not bright enough to illuminate the barn properly. It only stained the wood around it, the way infection stains the skin around a wound. It took me a moment to understand that there was a hole in the barn floor. The boards had buckled around it, splintered upward, as if something beneath the earth had pushed its way through. The exposed edges looked soft in places, dark and slick between the splinters, and the light seemed to pulse from underneath the wetness. 2 figures stood at the edge of it. They were almost shaped like people. There were extra joints, wet clicks beneath the skin, insects moving across them as if they belonged to the same body. But my mind kept trying to make people out of them. One of them wore the remains of a nightgown. The other had my father's belt. I saw the brass buckle first, then the familiar notch where he had punched an extra hole with a nail because he refused to buy a new one. I had watched him do it at the kitchen table years ago, muttering that a belt was only finished when it broke in two. The figure turned towards me. It did not turn all at once. The belt moved first, then the chest. Then the head followed too late, as if the parts struggled to work together. "Henry," it said again. The voice was wrong. Too thin in some places, too crowded in others. But somewhere inside it, buried beneath the clicking, was my father. "Dad?" The thing wearing his belt shifted closer. One foot dragged, the other lifted too high. The knees bent unnaturally. The insects on the walls stirred with it. "Sun gone, less warmth," it shuddered. The second figure opened its mouth. For a moment, I expected my mother's voice. Instead, the walls answered. The insects shifted together, thousands of legs making the same dry rhythm. "Come closer." Then her voice came through, quieter and almost kind. "We must touch." Something clicked inside her mouth after the sentence ended, as if another set of teeth had finished speaking a moment too late. A small locket dangled from what had once been her neck. I remembered that locket. She wore it on birthdays and Christmas mornings, and every anniversary I could remember, even after the clasp started to bend, and Dad promised for 3 years that he would fix it. The thing wearing it lifted one hand towards the locket, but missed. Its fingers pressed into the skin beside it. Feeling for the object it struggled to locate. "You're not my parents," I muttered. The words came out weaker than I wanted. The two figures moved together. I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Their limbs crossed and uncrossed in the throbbing, sickly red glow that bled from the earth. Underneath the smell of dust and old hay came something damp and sour, like rotten fruit left in a closed shed. There was another smell beneath that too, sharper and drier, like cracked seed husks and metal. The insects began to make a sound that was almost language. A whisper passed through the barn. It came from the walls, the beams, the hayloft, the hole in the floor. The same few syllables repeated again and again, overlapping until they almost made sense. It reminded me of prayer, though I could not have said what was being prayed for. The figure with my mother's locket reached for me. It paused inches from my face. Its fingers opened and closed in small, impatient movements. Something cold touched my cheek. A narrow limb, jointed in too many places, pressed against my skin. I felt a sting as it cut me. I tried to move back, but something caught my leg. At first I thought it was a rope, then it tightened. Tiny points pressed through my denim, through my sock, and into the skin of my calf. I looked down and saw a pale, centipede-like limb coiling around my lower leg, small teeth digging into my skin. A cold numbness spread from my calf, crawling upwards faster than the pain. "Please!" I cried. The red light pulsed from the hole. With every pulse, the insect shifted towards it, then away, as if the whole barn had learned to breathe. The thing with my father's belt leaned down. Something in its mouth moved aside. For 1 second, through the moving parts and wet membrane, I saw something pale beneath that might have once been a face. The limb around my leg began to pull. I slid across the dirt floor towards the hole. My eyes darted around the barn, looking for anything that could help. The tractor lights flickered again. The insects on the walls lifted themselves slightly. My hand struck something hard in my pocket. For a second, I could not understand it. Then my fingers closed around the object, the couple's lighter. My thumb had already begun to go numb. I opened the lid and found the wheel by touch. The first strike failed, so did the second. Sweat made the metal slick beneath my thumb. The thing holding my leg tightened again, its small teeth working deeper into my calf. I pressed down until the wheel bit into my skin and struck again. The wicks caught. 2 small flames rose together. I twisted as far as the paralysis would allow me and threw the lighter into the leftover hay. For one awful moment, I thought the flames would go out before the lighter landed. Then it disappeared into the old hay beneath the loft. Dad only bought authentic lighters made to last. If it wasn't for his love of strange little machines, I would be dead now. The hay caught fire almost immediately. The first insects to burn made no sound. They curled in on themselves and dropped. Then the fire reached the wall, and the sound rose all at once, thin and furious, from the walls and beams. The limb around my leg released me. My body lurched to a stop, and I rolled onto my side, coughing through dust and smoke. Behind me, the figures separated. For a moment, I saw my father's belt buckle flash in the firelight. I saw my mother's locket swing, catching the red glow from below and the orange light above. Then the insects covered them. I crawled. The floor tore at my palms, smoke filled my mouth. Something burned above me, and bits of hay fell like sparks. One landed on the back of my hand and stuck there until I scraped it off against the floor. I dug my fingers into the dirt and dragged myself towards the open barn door until I felt the evening air on my face. I used the last of my strength to roll onto my back. The barn was burning. The once beautiful barn, the one my father had scrubbed and painted and cursed the birds over, was nothing but flame. I watched it until the smoke forced my eyes shut. I'm sorry, Dad, but don't blame the starlings.